Hello, and welcome back to what was once known as the Star Wars Guys YouTube channel, where the Force is family. And there's a reason that I introduced this video in that manner, because obviously now we're known as Fandomology. And for the record, I'm speaking quietly right now because everyone else is currently asleep in the house, and I don't want to wake them up. It is currently 6:05 in the morning right now. But I wanted to do this because I was unable to sleep this morning. I stopped being able to sleep at like 5:30. And you know how when you're trying to get back to sleep, you find yourself just kind of wandering off in thoughts. And I happen to be thinking about my time here on YouTube and just sort of where I started and where I am now. And I found it interesting just how my thoughts and opinions on certain things have changed since then. And I kind of want to talk about one of those with you guys today, specifically about the idea of, especially with the Ahsoka show out right now, the idea of the sequel trilogy and everything around it being retconned out allegedly by the Ahsoka show. Now, go back and rewatch some of the very, very, very early stuff that myself and Michael did with the channel. And I especially was very vocal back then about the idea of the sequel trilogy retcon and how I was all for it. Now, however, I have, granted, it's not been just a snap decision. It's been a long, slow process. But now I've like completely 180'd on that decision. And I think that not only is a sequel trilogy retcon or being erased from canon just outright not going to happen, I'm kind of the opinion now that if it were to happen, it would actually be a very bad thing overall. Now, before we break that down, for those that are new and weren't there in the beginning, let me go ahead and just give a brief synopsis as to my thoughts overall on Disney Star Wars. I am one of those that think that, on the whole, Disney has totally mismanaged Star Wars. Now, that's not to say that I think that every single thing that they've done is garbage, but in my opinion, according to my tastes, there has been way too many middling to just downright terrible things that Disney has done with Star Wars that outnumber the genuinely good things that they do. As far as the sequel trilogy specifically goes, I am one of those that do think that The Last Jedi, on the whole, was just absolutely terrible, easily the worst of the Star Wars movies, because of how it absolutely desecrated Luke Skywalker. And yeah, the same thing happened with Han in The Force Awakens, becoming a deadbeat dad, completely undoing his character progression from the original trilogy. And then I kind of give him a little bit of leeway, kind of not by choice, though, with Rise of Skywalker, because by that point, Carrie Fisher had passed away. And so they kind of had to do what they did, maybe in a different way, sure, but I feel like their hands were tied on that one. I do believe that The Force Awakens is probably the best movie out of the sequel trilogy, pretty much by default, as far as being a competently made movie, even if it, yes, is basically diet A New Hope. And my favorite of the sequel trilogy is still The Rise of Skywalker, despite and kind of because of how much of a mess it is and how much they tried to course correct from The Last Jedi. I could go on about my thoughts on everything else that Disney has done, but we'll just keep it at that for the sequel trilogy, because that's what's relevant right now. So I have seen friends of mine on YouTube talking about the idea that with the Ahsoka show here and Ahsoka currently in the world between worlds, that are we finally going to get the retcon of the sequel trilogy? And like I said before, take the version of me from 2020, 2021 and put him here in the seat where I'm sitting now, seeing Ahsoka like this, and yeah, he'd be like, oh yes, it's gonna happen, it's gonna happen. We're finally getting rid of the sequel trilogy. However, having seen everything that I have from the end of Mando Season 2, which I think is the single best thing that Disney has ever done with Star Wars, to now, going through Book of Boba Fett, which I think was garbage, Kenobi, which was a very big and personal disappointment to me because Obi-Wan's my favorite character, being very disappointed with Mando Season 3, and overall liking Andor, but it barely felt like Star Wars to me. Seeing all of that stuff there's just little clues in there still that they're still leading to the sequel trilogy, especially in Andor outright name dropping places like Canto Bight and Jakku, and Mando Season 3 showing the incompetence of, well, not necessarily the incompetence, but the apathy of the citizens and certain officials of the New Republic to the Imperial remnants, for example. And it's all setting the stage for the rise of the First Order, which then, of course, comes along and crushes the New Republic. Now, granted, there's still like a 30 or so year gap between where we are right now in the Mandoverse and the beginning of The Force Awakens. But the seeds are already being planted. So that has sort of contributed to why I think the way that I do now about Disney just not doing the sequel trilogy retcon at all. They've made the movies, and they've got to tie into them somehow. But what about the world between worlds? Here's where we get to the part where I think this would be a bad idea. Number one, even if Disney wanted to do something about the sequel trilogy, they're not going to outright erase it from canon. The most that they will do is create a branching timeline, one where the sequel trilogy happens, one where the sequel trilogy doesn't happen. What that would look like, I mean, we could speculate about that all day, but it's not exactly relevant for the sake of this video. And I've had different conversations about this, of course, with my friend Tim, Coffee on Korriban, on his channel. And he makes a point that I find myself agreeing with, in that splitting the timeline like that, and Tim, if you watch this and I get your words wrong, of course, please tell me. But splitting the timeline like that is just going to make things more messy and make things like not matter as much as if there was one timeline. Because in general, time travel can be used to go back and undo whatever consequences you want. That was, in fact, it's been a minute, but if I'm not mistaken, that was kind of the whole point of Avengers Endgame. The Avengers going back in time to undo the damage that Thanos had done with the snap. So if Ahsoka was to use the world between worlds to somehow erase the sequel trilogy out, who's to say that someone else couldn't use the world between worlds to theoretically erase the original trilogy and make it so that Anakin never turned to the dark side? And imagine how many people that would make mad. So the idea that Disney was ever just going to outright erase the sequel trilogy, that was never going to happen. And respectfully to those that are still believing that, it's time to stop. But here's the thing also with that. From an out-of-universe perspective, if Disney was to do anything to divert from the main canon where it's going, I see it playing out like this among the fan base. It's an undeniable fact that the fan base is incredibly, incredibly divided. Yes, I know the prequel started it, but the sequel trilogy and pretty much as a whole, Disney Star Wars has made it worse, where you have those that really do like pretty much all of Disney Star Wars. Yes, I know the term shill gets thrown around a lot. I don't like that term. I'm not going to use it. And then you have those that don't like it, the more old school fans, which, yes, I'm a child of the prequels, but I kind of associate myself with. I do not think for a second that if they were to retcon the sequel trilogy, that's going to bring the fan base together. That is impossible at this point. If anything, it's going to make the divide even worse, because you're going to have the fans of the sequel trilogy, the fans of Disney Star Wars, that are most likely going to see this move as Disney catering to the older fans and taking something away from them that they love, which is likely going to cause them to lash out against the old school fans even more. Like, the old school fans already are being called every ist and faux name in the book by pointing out all the different things that are wrong with Disney Star Wars. And that would be increased if Disney was to take the sequel trilogy away in any way from the fans that like them. So it's one of those things where the situation that Disney is in with Star Wars right now is just not good, as far as having a united fan base and just drumming up the excitement that's there. Like, outside of my own little YouTube circle, I really don't hear anyone talking about Ahsoka. And I think if Disney was to try and retcon the sequel trilogy or make an alternate timeline, I think things overall will be worse for Disney Star Wars than they are now. Basically, this is a long-winded way of saying better the devil you know than the devil you don't. I'd rather maintain the status quo right now than make such a radical change and risk further division. Call me a fence sitter if you want, but at least right now, that's where my headspace is. So hopefully I explained this adequately enough. If there's something I didn't convey very well, keep in mind this is like around 6 o'clock this morning. So if there's something I didn't convey very well, of course, let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to expand upon that as much as I can. And of course, if you disagree with anything, let me know in the comments. I'd like to have a discussion about this. But in the meantime, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'm going to go ahead and bring this old slogan out of retirement. But just remember, the Force is family. And we'll see you guys later.